Hi, I just thought I would make a quick video because this new news story has recently broken. When I first saw it, it just kind of, passed me by. I wasn't all that interested. But then I was listening to The Level, the duckfeed.tv podcast today, and Cole Ross, one of the hosts of that show, brought up this story again. And I got to thinking, well, this is really a story that I personally can, speak to because I have a stake in the issue, or at least, I'm somebody who has had a stake in the issue of whether or not Square Enix should use crowdfunding to localize its games. Um, so I guess there's a lot of different ways you can look at this whole thing. Personally, just to give my opinion up front, I think that it's not a terrible idea. I I have, done Kickstarter. I've backed some games. Some of them have been very good. Some of them have been mediocre, and some of them have been really disappointing. Um, for those of you who watched the Front Mission 5 playthrough, you probably remember me talking about Celestian Tales, and that was a game I kickstarted, and I was satisfied with that, certainly. It did have a few bugs and glitches here and there, but overall I thought it was a really good game that probably would have never been made if it wasn't for Kickstarter and for crowdfunding. And that is definitely an indie kind of situation. It doesn't get any more indie than that. Um, Now, if you go to the opposite side of the scale, you're looking at a company like Square Enix, which has a very large market capitalization, and they can uh, they can publish games just fine. But they can't publish all of their games just fine because some games, well, they might be big hits or they might completely flop. And, well, that is a matter of that's the kind of risk that a business has to undergo. And asking consumers to assume that risk by paying for the localization of a game, it does feel a little bit sleazy because if the game is a hit, then Square Enix could see some pretty significant profits that, you know, um, well, a lot of the risk involved in localizing the game, they didn't really pay for, right? They didn't pay to deal with. So there is that side of the argument, right? I can completely understand that, consumers should not be assuming the risk of publishing a game because that's what developers are supposed to do. And if they are just profiting off of the game without assuming any risk, then, well, that is a pretty significant issue. However, it's not quite so simple because if you're talking about a game that has already been made and the question is whether or not it should be localized, well, the developers already assume the risk of developing the game and bringing it to market in Japan, right? In the case of Square Enix. The only question is whether or not they should assume the additional risk of localizing the game and then publishing it in or like overseas. So as far as the publishing side goes, if we assume that the people who back the localization get essentially a pre-order of the game, um, that does fulfill the role that Kickstarter has been beginning to fulfill in the games industry, which is to substitute for pre-orders as a way of minimizing publisher risk. Um, right, so that is a thing, but when you compare it to Kickstarter, you are actually almost guaranteed to get a game. Whereas with Kickstarter, you don't know if the game will actually be made or not. In this case, the game is made, right? It's just a matter of localizing the game and then bringing it to market. So there's much less risk of the whole thing never panning out and it just all collapsing and your money evaporating into a black hole. So that doesn't feel quite so bad. Um, as far as the localization side goes, well, yes, you are paying for the localization, and that risk is like entirely absorbed by the money you are paying, right? So the company is taking no risk on localizing the game. They're only taking a risk on publishing the game, right? So you are contributing something to the whole process that you wouldn't be contributing otherwise. But on the other hand, you're actually getting a game that you wouldn't be getting otherwise. Now, what some fans or some gamers will say is, what about fan translations, right? What about the Front Mission fan translation project? What about the Mother 3 fan translation? Well, I did the Front Mission 5 fan translation. I tried to do the Front Mission 2 fan translation. And what I can say is, in some cases, the fan translation can be done. It's technically feasible to do it. In the case of Front Mission 5, I believe that the files were left in a fairly open state so that we essentially could pick this up and do it ourselves, right? So I personally contributed hundreds of hours of labor to make the game, the fan translation happen, and as did my team members, of course. And that was what I contributed. Instead of paying Square Enix money, I contributed hundreds of hours of labor. The people who didn't donate to our project and who just downloaded the patch and got the fan translation, well, they probably contributed, a few hours trying to rip the game and apply the patch and learn how to do all that stuff. But it's certainly a lower cost to them than paying for a localization. But on the other hand, as much work as I put into the whole thing, I noted in my Let's Play through the game that there were many points where I didn't feel quite satisfied with the translation because of the technical limitations that we ran into. And if you asked me at the beginning of the fan translation project, would you give Square Enix $70 to get a pre-ordered pre-order official translation of the game? I think I would have at that time said yes, absolutely yes. There is the point that the translations of the Front Mission series in North America, in the West, typically censored the scripts, and that would have been a loss for us if we had gotten a censored script as opposed to the uncensored script which I tried to produce, right? So there is that value added that a fan translation can offer that no publisher can offer at any price, right? As long as they want to continue to censor their games in the West, then they can't offer that. Only a fan translation project can offer that. So absolutely, I do not think that I would like to see companies shutting down fan translations because they are bringing a commercial product to market because of their protecting their brand or being afraid of incurring censors' wrath or whatever. I really hope that doesn't happen. But like I said, the technical limitations with fan translation projects can really get in the way of producing a definitive translation of the game, not to mention the problems of doing this whole thing as a volunteer, piece of work. I especially would point to the Front Mission 2 fan translation as a good example of when technical limitations really, really kill the fan translation effort. Because we had the script translated, it was good, and we could not get a definitive translation of the game out as a patch. And would I pay to see a definitive translation of that game come to market? Yeah, I probably would. As long as it was a definitive translation, right? As long as it wasn't censored, as long as it wasn't a, you know, hack job kind of. I wouldn't say that Square Enix would do a hack job of it, but what I mean to say is I want the real thing, right? I want the full translation of the game, and I think that is something that would have to be negotiated between fans and the publisher when it came to funding the translation. Because if they're going to say, we want you to assume the risk for translating this game, well, the fans are going to say, we want the real deal, right? We do not want, the typical standard of translation that was present in the PS1, PS2 era, outside of the marquee like Final Fantasy products, where corners were cut and so on. We want the real deal, right? That would definitely be a condition for saying this is okay. That they really do a good job, right? So essentially, what I'm saying is because of technical limitations, right? I think that first because of technical limitations, second because of labor limitations for volunteer products, or I think that this is a possibility that could be positive if we saw games like Front Mission 2 come to market and actually have like a solid translation. Like that is a game that would not sell, okay? Like, you could say, oh, Square Enix, they got so much money, why don't they just publish Front Mission 2? Well, because it is a game that would not sell. It would not sell. It looks like garbage, and it is extremely arcane and difficult, and it would only appeal to the hardcore fans. So, but would I like to see it come to market? Yes, I would. Of course I would. I would like to see a definitive version come to market just to say, hey, the whole series is out there. This is the most plot central game outside of Front Mission 1 in the entire series, and I'm glad to see it come to market. I think that's all pretty reasonable. Now, if you're talking about new games, saying Square Enix will not localize this game unless the fans do a pre-order, right? Do a crowdfunding pre-order translation. I don't think, okay, if, this is the absurd scenario. Square Enix says, we are not going to bring FF14 to the West unless you pony up the money. Well, what if the fans got really angry and said, F you, right? Would Square Enix not bring the game to the West after spending years and years and years pouring money into its development? Of course not, right? Of course not. So, I think that, even if this became a common practice, I don't think that fans would crowdfund a AAA title that obviously the developer is essentially obligated to bring to the foreign market just to recoup their costs. Like Japan, the Japanese market, especially the Japanese console market, which is shrinking and shrinking, it just could not possibly support sales of a game of that level of commitment and investment. It's just not possible. So you would be looking more at would a game like Xenoblade Chronicles, would that get localized or not, it's a crowdfunding issue. I could see that happen, right? That was obviously a previous gen game, and I don't see many games like that coming down the pipe in the future because of the way that development costs are going and the Japanese console market is going. But if there was such a thing like that, I could see it happen. Dragon Quest, yeah, that's also a possibility because that's a very large localization endeavor. And, if the fans really want it and the cost of pre ordering is not exorbitant, um, I don't think it's such a bad thing, right? I don't think it's such a bad thing. So, let me know what you think in the comments. You might expect me to come down on this the other way and say, no, no, we should leave it up to the fan translations. Well, one game that I would really like to Let's Play is Brigandine Grand Edition. And for technical reasons, as far as I know, the fan translation of that never managed to come to completion. The definitive translation of that game was never produced. And if you said to me, "Well, would you pay $30 for an official translation of this game, like brought to I don't know PC or something?" I would say yes, indeed, I certainly would. There are cases where A, having a high level of polish, and B, overcoming the technical limitations that are on a game could create opportunities for this kind of thing to work. As for the question of whether or not I think this would kill the fan translation scene, I don't think it would, because in addition to the localization costs, there are also considerable legal issues that a company has to go through in order to bring a game to a foreign market. And fan translation is another way to get around that problem. Now, of course, you could say that all legal problems are shallow given enough crowdfunding, but I still think there are games that would not be localized because of that issue. And finally, I would say that because the Japanese games market is, it's shrinking and shrinking, it's going to mobile. The Vita is the last handheld Sony is going to make. The PS4 is not selling all that well here. And like, I think the console market, the glory days are over in Japan, right? It's over, right? There's gonna be there's gonna be something Nintendo does that will carry on, and will have some life to it. And I think Sony will continue to produce games, but will they not localize them? I mean, not Sony, but Sony platform developers. Of course, they're going to localize them. As far as new games go, because they won't be able to survive based on the Japanese market, and that whole distinctness of the Japanese scene is going to, outside of very niche stuff that Square Enix wouldn't produce anyway, is probably not going to continue. Right? That whole oh, it's in Japan, it's only in Japan. You got if you know Japanese, it's the only way you can play this game. We're seeing Tales of Zestria is coming to PC in the West. That is unbelievable, right? That is something I would never have expected 5-10 years ago. I am very happy about that. I'm also very happy that we're seeing Koei bring its big ticket games. Hopefully, we're going to see Romance of the Three Kingdoms the new Romance of the Three Kingdoms come to PC in the West. But we did see Nobunaga's Ambition come to PC in the West. That's pretty niche. And again, it was like you could only play those games on console in the West, and sometimes they wouldn't even get brought out. Well, if Nobunaga's Ambition, they certainly wouldn't get brought out. So I think like Japanese developers are starting to see the appeal of Steam. Japanese developers are definitely feeling the pressure to internationalize their sales. And so, even if this does become a thing, I think that it might not last very long because the distinctness of the Japanese market may evaporate and it may only carry on in the mobile space because, yeah, like I mean, on the Vita, we are seeing a lot of dungeon crawlers and visual novel games that can take advantage of the the number of talented 2D artists that are in Japan, and B, take advantage of the high quality screen on the Vita, and still have a fairly low development cost. But that platform is its days are numbered, right? It's not going to carry on that much longer. And then whatever Nintendo brings out is probably, um, well, I don't know what's going to happen with Nintendo. You might see some kind of niche market continue there, but I really think it's going to be on mobile that Japan only thing is going to continue. And unless Square Enix became like the go-between for fans and niche developers to provide crowdfunding organization for Japanese games, I don't know how long this whole thing would carry on. Like if we got, I don't know. I mean, if we got localization of um, what is even a game I would like to see localized? Maybe there's not very much Square Enix has made that hasn't made it abroad that I would like to see localized other than the front mission games. But that's just me, right? Um, there may be something that was in the Dragon Quest series that would certainly be worth bringing over. Um, but I don't expect this would be like a huge ongoing thing. I think it's something that might thrive for a few years, but as the market changes, it might go away. So those are my thoughts on the matter. I am certainly not one to uh, encourage uh, exploitation of consumers, but um, there are those games that people would like to see ported or not ported. Well, I guess in some cases ported and then also localized, right? So old games we'd like to see ported and also, if possible, localized. Um, and I think if the fan translation community hasn't already done it or hasn't been able to do it up to a professional level of polish, then yeah, it would be nice if we could pre-order the games and see them localized. So let me know what you think. This has just been a very impromptu discussion, but since I'm somebody who has been pretty deeply involved in the whole issue, I thought I'd just throw my thoughts up there on the internet. And that's about all I've got to say for now.